All right, so moving on to the final segment, I'll be sharing my fight summary on the fight that took place last night in the sport of boxing between Chris Eubanks Jr. and Connor Benn. So last night in the sport of boxing, it was Chris Eubank Jr. defeating Connor Benn by unanimous decision last night in the sport of boxing. So I'll be sharing my fight summary on the fight that took place there. Now I will say, this is obviously a early fight of the year candidate between Chris Eubank Jr. and Connor Benn. The show that they put on last night for the sport of box was absolutely tremendous. Watching the fight at home, you could feel the electricity and the atmosphere that UK crowd had in London for these two respective fighters putting on the show. You could hear the aspirations and you could hear the excitement coming out of the commentary. The commentary did a great job over there across the seas in the UK. You could just feel the energy from watching and listening to the fight at home. But round 12 of this fight between Chris Eubank and Connor Benn was probably the best round of boxing that I've seen since Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano had back in November in round 10 of their rematch that they had on the Jake Paul Mike Tyson card. But it was so amazing back and forth in the 12th round between Chris Eubank and Connor Benn. Both fighters just honestly they both deserved to win that night, and they put on a show for us. But I just don't agree with the three judges that scored at 116-112. When you score a fight 116-112, that means the winner of that fight won 8 rounds compared to the loser of that fight only winning 4 rounds. I thought the fight was completely closer than that. If anything, I would have scored at 115-113. I think that's a more respectable score for Chris Eubank, or a draw. And I know Chris Eubank did outland Connor Benn, but watching it, I didn't really know who was going to win that fight until I looked back and rewatched at the highlights this morning. And yes, I will agree that Chris Eubank did win that fight. And again, I would have scored at 115-113 rather than a 116-112. But both of these fighters put on a tremendous fight, and hats off to both of them. And I did think Chris Eubank did a tremendous job in this fight. What he did, controlling the pace of the fight with his jab and establishing the power against a smaller fighter like Connor Benn, was the correct game plan. And that was the best performance I've ever seen out of Chris Eubank. Chris Eubank is, I mean, he's a known name, known name across the seas. But if you ask a casual, they're not going to know who Chris Eubank is. And Chris Eubank is somebody that's never been a world champion, but that was a world championship performance last night that he had against Connor Benn. I think that was the best performance of his boxing career, hands down. And he has everything to be proud of in that fight. And meanwhile, for Connor Benn, he has nothing to be ashamed of at all. He fought the best fight, I believe, in his boxing career. Now, he came up 2 weight classes against Chris Eubank. And if you guys know that Connor Benn does fight at the welterweight division, but he did move up to the middleweight division at 160 to fight Chris Eubank. And there was a 10-pound rehydration clause. So both of these fighters didn't come in there 190, 200 for the fight. At a solid 170 was the max. So I still give Connor Benn a lot of credit for climbing up 2 weight classes for this fight to even happen. At times, being alert defensively was Connor Benn's downfall. I think at times that Connor Benn wasn't alert defensively, and that's where he started to get hit with some counter punches. Some powerful punches were definitely connecting on Connor Benn. As you can see, his legs were being wobbled. Legs looked like they were running on thin ice towards the end of the fight. And at times, I would say Connor Benn did play it safe against Chris Eubank. I thought when I seen Chris Eubank hurt a lot. Instead, Connor Benn would back off and retreat off the back foot, which I think you should have fought on the inside and gave Chris Eubank some more problems. But this was a physical war between these two respective men. I mean, there was bloodline legacy on the line. There was animosity between them of a 3-year buildup. A fight that we were realistically supposed to see all the way back in 2022. But we know the steroid test that tested positive for Connor Benn, and his claim of eating 38 eggs a day to be as ripped as he was, like an action figure, when in reality he was taking steroids. So that's the reason why we finally got this fight instead of getting that fight back in 2022. But I will say, Connor Benn coming back and showing that he can nearly defeat a fighter like Chris Eubank at this division without cheating was remarkable. And I will say, both of these fighters have earned my respect. Both of these fighters gave us one hell of a fight. And again, I think this is an early fight of the year candidate based off the fights and the performances that I've seen so far in 2025. And it's crazy to think that Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn being Connor Benn's dad, fought each other twice in the early 90s. In 1990, where Chris Eubank Sr. knocked out Nigel Benn, and then in the rematch in 1993, 3 years later, that went to a draw. So to see their sons go to war 30 plus years later, and then sit next to each other while their sons are in the ring dueling and battling it out, giving us one hell of a show, that was great to see. And that's what this sport is all about. It's all about honesty. It's all about integrity. It's all about going to war, fighting for the right reasons. And when you have a perfect story like you have of two fathers fighting each other, bad blood and bloodlines forming, and you see the next generation of your own kids fighting each other, that prove why one last name is superior over the other. Who doesn't love that shit in boxing? This is what boxing fans love. We love dramatic stories. We love a dramatic storyline. We love chaotic fights. We love fights that we will want to go back and reminisce and think about the first time we watched for the first time. So enough of me being symptomatic, but that was just one hell of a fight last night between Chris Eubank and Connor Benn. Now, what's next for these two respective fighters, I'll get into before I close out the segment. Now, what's next for Chris Eubank? Now, possibly he could give Connor Benn a rematch in September. Now, Turki Al-Sheikh has said that if both fighters are healthy, he would love to run the rematch again in London again in September this year, in the second half of 2025. Now, if that rematch between Connor Benn and Chris Eubank does not happen, I know it does not sound the best, but I feel like somehow, some way, Chris Eubank is going to weasel his way into fighting the winner of Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford in September. I feel like he's going to weasel his way to fight the winner of that fight for an undisputed super middleweight title fight. I could just see it happening. And I know people out there watching will get mad for what I will say, but Canelo Alvarez is the perfect cherry picker at this particular point of his boxing career. And if he does get past Terence Crawford, I have no doubt in my mind, based on that 4-fight deal that he has with Turki Al-Sheikh, that's worth a lot of money, that he would cherry pick Chris Eubank based off of this performance against Connor Benn. So I think that's in the play for Chris Eubank. Now, what's next for Connor Benn? Obviously, like I just said, a rematch is in the cards between himself and Chris Eubank. If that doesn't happen, Connor Benn will go back down to the welterweight division. He said it in an interview following the fight yesterday that he would be open to fighting Mario Barrios for the WBC title at the welterweight division. Hint, Mario Barrios is the weakest link champion-wise at this welterweight division between himself, Jaron Ennis, and Brian Norman Jr. But realistically, if he doesn't get the rematch against Chris Eubank, there are some big money fights at the welterweight division for Connor Benn. With Eddie Hearns being his promoter signed with Matchroom Boxing, Eddie Hearns would definitely get him in a big-time fight at 147. Some fights against Mario Barrios for the WBC title, a chance for Connor Benn to become a world champion for the first time in his boxing career. Possibly a fight against Jaron Ennis. Both are signed with Matchroom Boxing. Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, Brian Norman Jr. I mean, the possibilities are there for some big fights that Connor Benn could have in the future. And based off this performance, I think my perception has changed with Connor Benn. I viewed him as a cheater. I viewed him as someone that did not give a damn about the integrity of what comes with this sport. But now, he's won a fan over in me. He has my respect, and I'll definitely be paying attention to his career more moving forward. But I think both of these respective fighters have some big paydays on the horizon for whatever comes next for them. But that is my Chris Eubank and Connor Benn fight summary. And that is all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. This is your host, Thomas Tyree, signing off. And I'll see you guys on next week's episode.